have to have them on file. Yeah, I know, I know you've kind of recently signed up with us, and I usually send out a memo about once a year, like, hey, don't forget to send our listings, but this is over here. So once you guys get them signed, just email them over to me. I can give them a quick glance. They do need broker initials on them, so we make sure that we get broker initials on them, send them back to you, and then we keep them on file for you. Now, there are going to be some optional items that are not on your list that I gave you. So one of those optional items is going to be your trust advisory, your representative capacity signature disclosure, the manufactured home listing addendum, the probate listing addendum, your vacant land listing agreement, and the seller's vacant land advisory. These are optional because these are not going to apply every time unless you're dealing with a trust or a third-party signer like a power of attorney, a trust, a trustee, or an officer of a corporation, and then of course your manufactured home, probate, vacant, seller's vacant land. Once you click that box, and I'll go over it with you in a minute, these items will generate. So these are just optional ones that you should be aware of. All right, so let me catch my breath here. So the first one here is that we're going to go into is going to be your disclosure regarding agency relationships. I think most of us are familiar with this form. We see it in our purchase agreements, and then we also see it in our listing agreement. So this is what it looks like. It's that first page there. So on every slide, and I'll give you guys a copy of this presentation as well, because I kind of just went step by step on the to-do list on every single page that we have to fill out and what needs to go on there. So on our 81, this is the first page on our purchase agreements, and it's also the first page on our listing agreements. Why? Because this establishes agency relationships between you and your seller, and you and your buyer, you and your client. So it's really important to set that relationship up. So what do we do on this form? We just mark the seller box. We have them sign it and read it. We put our Dynasty information on there, the business number, so it's included on there. And then when you sign it, add your license number and date. So that's pretty much it. The second page is points, so I didn't include it. Your Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory, also known as your FHDA. This is what it looks like here. So it's a 2-page document. This one's fairly new. Kind of just got tacked on, I think, in the last couple of years here. And this one, why is this form important? It just provides guidance and information related to fair housing laws, best practices, that your clients and you as an agent should look out for. And who signs it? Just your seller. The seller signs it and dates it on page 2. Now, on a lot of these forms, you're going to see that there's a line for the buyer. Don't worry about that now because there's not a buyer. We're just signing the listing agreement. So it's okay to not have a buyer's signature at this stage in the transaction. These are also signed with the purchase agreement, so we get a fully executed document once that happens. Okay. And then our PRBS, possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. I'm sure you guys are familiar with this one too. This is what this one looks like. And this one just identifies that it's a real estate brokerage can be working with more than one buyer or seller. What does that mean? I work for Dynasty Real Estate. You work for Dynasty Real Estate. We may be competing for the same property. Even though we're not representing the same buyer, the same property. Well, no, sorry, the same buyer. We still work under the same brokerage. So we have to let the consumers know that. So that's why we sign this form. So again, the seller signs it. Also on the selling side, why is this form important? Someone might come at, if it's my listing, I might, put an offer on my listing. Also means that the same brokerage is representing, different clients. All right. Let me get some water. I haven't talked this much and this loud in a while. All right. Any questions so far? No? All right, buyer fraud advisory. I'm sure you guys have also seen this form. fairly often. It's also part of our purchase package. And this one just gives the consumer information on how to safeguard their information. There's a lot of wire fraud, going on. So, we just give them this informational tool on how to best safeguard their information. I know we always have those conversations with our clients about not just wiring, their deposits or any money to escrow without having any actual correct and verified information. All right, so what you're here for, the listing agreement. So why is our listing agreement important? It spells out the broker and seller duties, and then it spells out the terms of our listing, and it also gives us the authority to execute the listing agreement and represent them and negotiate on the seller's behalf. It also secures our commission, so it's important to have it signed. All right, so sorry it's gonna be a little bit hard to see, but I basically broke down the first few pages on by section and what needs to be filled out. So on the first page, section 1, there's going to be a lot of different information, but it's fairly simple. The date that we prepared it. So on the very top left corner, it says date prepared. I see that left blank a lot. Make sure that you're putting your date on there. Why? Because that's what we reference back to when we're making amendments to the listing agreement. Or anything in writing, that's the date that we reference to. It's not when the contract starts or ends, but the date prepared. So make sure that is added. And then your seller's name, very important. Now on the seller name, let's make sure that we have the correct seller. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of trusts. I'm sorry. So we deal with trusts, we deal with corporations. We're not necessarily dealing with an actual individual when they're selling the properties. So if we are dealing with the trust, it has to be the name of the trust. The trust is the seller, not the person signing, but the actual trustee. So always check your property profiles, if possible your prelim. We'll get into prelims in a minute, but just verify that whoever is signing is the correct and legal owner of that property. It's happened where the incorrect person signs. This happened a few years ago with an agent. They thought they had a listing agreement because the seller signed, and it wasn't even someone that was on title. So someone would came in and swooped the listing from them because they got it, the correct seller to sign it. So very important. Number 3, the beginning date of the contract and the ending date of the contract. I see the ending date blank a lot. That is not legal in the state of California. We have to have a beginning and ending. Any contract in the state of California has to have an actual timeline. So make sure they're not left blank. Of course, your property address, the city. Don't forget the county. The county's left blank a lot because it's kind of on this side over here. So don't forget your county, your zip code. And another one that's also left blank a lot is going to be your assessor parcel number on this side there. If you don't know how to find your assessor parcel number, that is also on the prelim and it's also on the property profile. If you guys have questions on that, you can always reach out to us as well. Any questions on that? No? All right, one more thing, right below, kind of towards that bottom of the boxes, 2 little boxes there. So those are going to be optional forms. If the property is a manufactured home or if it's being sold as a probate, the CAR actually got rid of the manufactured home listing agreement and the probate listing agreement. Now they're all included in one, but if you do mark those boxes, if it does apply, the actual advisory and the addendum will generate on zip forms. So that'll be a different class because we'll get into it too long. All right, so section 2. So right below, this was actually a little bigger. Right below section 1, we just filled out the general information. This was pretty self-explanatory, but I also see this blank, our listing price and our terms. just type in the listing price, guys. I sometimes see the blanks that are like, okay, what's the listing price? What are we agreeing to sell it at? Listing terms may or may not apply to you, but sometimes I see different listing terms. For example, a fairly common one is, I'm charging 6% and I'm giving 3% to the selling agent. But if I sell the house, if I double end it, I'm only going to charge 4%. So those would be different listing terms, and those would go on to the. All right. All right, this is going to be my, I think, most important talk here, compensation to broker. This one's really important because this one's what dictates how much we're getting paid as a brokerage and how much we're paying to the cooperating broker. This is a very, very common mistake I see is I see 2% on the top and then 2% on the bottom. And people turn them in this way. What does that mean? It means that you're only charging 2% and that you're giving the entirety of the 2% commission to the cooperating broker. Do not do that. The top should be the total percentage that you're charging, whether it's 6, 5, 3, whatever you're going to be charging in total goes on the top. And then what you are offering the cooperating broker goes on 3B1. So please make sure that those are completed correctly. This is also why I asked for you guys to send me your listing agreements, because I have caught that a lot and we have to correct that right away. We cannot charge a seller more than what is on 3A. Otherwise, we have to get that modified, and that's kind of an embarrassing conversation to have with yourself. They're like, sorry, I offered my commission to the other agent. You have to fix it so I get paid too. So make sure that they're signed correctly, guys. I'm sorry, filled out correctly. Also mark the boxes. I get those blank all the time. And there's a reason that that box is there, because that tells us whether it's a percentage or a dollar amount. So mark your boxes, guys. Okay.
So in that scenario too, worst case scenario, you close that file, and then let's say the seller decides to go take his paperwork over to attorney. He reviews that, you're gonna get a request from the attorney to refund all that cash.
Right.
So
and
you
we
just
also
work for
wouldn't
nothing.
allow that to happen, because that's why we check them, and that's why we have to have those listings, because legally we can't pay you guys. We can't, because if the DRE comes in and audits that file, they're gonna say, hey, wait a minute, you only charged 3%. Why is your agent getting paid 3%? So yeah, it's really important. So I think out of every single section we talk about, of course, your correct seller and correct commission are going to be the most important ones.
What is the average percentage nowadays for listing?
I've been seeing quite a bit of 5, going back to 5 again. Yeah. 2.5, per side. Yeah, depending on the dollar amount, if it's kind of north of the 700, that's kind of where you start to see the 2% come into play, or 2.25%. Anything north of $1 million, more often than not, it's going to be 2%. Yeah.
But then when they're hard to sell, they'll bump it up to 3.
Yeah.
The luxury market always takes the bigger hit. All right, guys, and then just one last thing on the first page. Just make sure that your seller's initials are on the bottom. I know we've focused a lot on that top section, on section 1, 2, and 3, but just don't forget about teeny tiny little initials at the bottom there. All right, so on to page 2. I'm add the property address. Once you type it into that first page, typically it's going to get generated already, but double check it, because usually if you miss something on the first page, you'll notice it right on the second page. So just make sure that the entire property address is there, and then the date. If that date is blank, it means that you missed that first date on page 1 that we talked about. So it's always good to give it a quick glance. Another important conversation we should be having with our sellers is going to be any items excluded or any items included in the property. For example, I had a listing a few years ago where my seller wanted to keep their chandelier. It was, a memento for them. It had, personal, they had a personal connection to it. So they wanted to keep the standard there, so I had to make sure that it was included in our listing agreement. So anything that's on this listing agreement, make sure you put it on that excluded line on the MLS, so that that expectation is already there. And then also put it in your counter offers, when your contract. We don't write the contracts, but put it in your counter offers just as a FYI. I know I put it on the MLS, but certain items are excluded from the sale. Any items included, so let's say they wanted to throw in the refrigerator, but make sure you get it in writing, because what you don't want to say, I never told you I want to get rid of my refrigerator, so it's always good to have it in writing. Any leased or not owned items, for example, your solar power systems, your alarm systems, propane tanks, or water softener. So anything that they're leasing out, or anything that's going to have a lien on the property. A common example of that is going to be your solar power system, or let's say that we're financing windows, doors, HVAC systems, or things like that. Make sure you're having these conversations with your sellers. Because sometimes they don't think about it. They assume you know, even though you don't own the property. So just make sure that you're having these conversations and you're putting it in writing. So. Sure.
For the sellers, if the ADT system doesn't work, but they have the what is it, the keypad
Like
or whatever, and the sensors.
So
So on that one, would you put excluded, like it's?
Well,
It's
you could put
included, or would you- it
included, but
doesn't
it's not set up. Like, we're
Okay.
leaving the hardware, we're leaving the equipment, it's just not set up. So
Okay.
you just have to make that distinction.
Included?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah,
Just the.
and if they wanted to, and we're starting to see this a lot, especially like with all the hardwiring alarm systems, like with Ring and all of that. Solar panels are another pretty common one nowadays. So those are gonna be the most common ones. But yes, I also see that they have like AT or whatnot, but they're just not, they're not signed up for it.
active, yeah.
But hey, we're gonna leave everything for you.
Okay.
Most of the time it's easier because usually those companies will follow you to your next home and
Correct.
set it up for you.
Okay.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, kind of towards the middle of that same page on page 2. Another common mistake I see is our multiple listing service. What is our broker MLS? And I see IVAR there, I see CVAR, I see Orange County, I see all kinds of different names. What should be on there is CRMLS. CRMLS is our actual MLS system. That is what most of the boards use. I think there's Matrix, Paragon, there's a few, but CRMLS down here is what our system is, so that's what goes in there. And that middle page, so that's that broker initial I'm talking to you about, which is why we need to get them submitted. That is just to let the sellers know why it's important to have our house on the MLS. Why is it important? It gives us the most exposure. Trulia, Redfin, Realtor.com, Zillow. We have a love-hate relationship with Zillow. Our sellers look for their properties on these websites. But if they're not on the MLS, they're not going to get on these websites because they're syndicated, through the MLS. So that's why it's important for sellers to understand the importance if they want to try to opt out of having their property on the MLS. I don't know why anyone would, but it happens. So they have to sign that middle section there. And then you sign on the next section, and then you send it over to us so we can get broker initials on it. This one doesn't happen very often, and it's on that bottom of page 2 of the listing agreement. It doesn't happen very often nowadays, but sometimes we have a seller that doesn't want the family to find out that they're selling the property, or the neighbors. Usually it comes from family issues. They don't want their family to know, and they don't want the property on the MLS at all. So if that happens, we have to have what's called a sell form. The sell form was used, I would say maybe like in the last year or so, when we were getting the property ready to market it. That doesn't exist anymore. We're gonna have another class next week with CRMLS. They're gonna be teaching that class about how to register your listings and how to avoid common listing mistakes as well. So they'll talk a little bit more about that. So I just wanted to bring up the sell form. It is still in use, but now we register the listings. This is mostly if we're just gonna keep it off market. And then, of course, seller initials right on the bottom again of the page. So don't forget those. So the seller is gonna sign on page, initial on page 2 twice. Easy way to remember that is 2, 2. All right, page 3. And this one I'm going to give Miss Patty Macias a little bit of props because we're reviewing a listing agreement a few weeks ago. So again, we're just going to verify our property address again. And then if we move down on that page, it talks about any reports. And Patty had a question, you know, do I mark, my seller wants to do a termite report. So do I mark the termite report now? You know, what reports do I mark? And I explained to her, we don't really mark anything here because that means that we're gonna get those reports in about 5 days. And what we don't wanna do is have the seller pay for reports that they may or may not need during the escrow period. Now, if they wanna pay for the termite report up front, if they're like, you know what, I think I'm gonna have a lot of, you know, termite damage and I wanna know what I'm getting myself into, fine, go ahead and order it before. If they may or may not wanna order it, and the buyer may not ask for it, you don't have to order the termite report. But one report that is very important is going to be your preliminary title report. Do not wait until you get into escrow, guys. Why? Because there could be liens. There could be a seller that shouldn't be in there. There could have been an uninsured transfer, you know, when they owned the property. So mark that the prelim report. And get those ordered if you haven't done so already. I typically order them right before I'm going to sign with my listing. And I also try to get the statement of information signed. If you guys want to write that down, your title rep will love you if you do that. Just to see if there's any liens on the property. To see if your sellers have any, a common one is going to be child support. Anything that's going to get attached to that property. So just order your prelims at the very, very least, and you know, do your homework on that so you avoid any potential problems during escrow. All right. On page 4, again, we'll reference back to the property address on top. And then section 19 is only going to apply if the property is an REO, a short sale, a trust, or if it's going to be a contingent sale. I'm not going to get into that disclosure again because that's kind of a class for another day. But a good question to ask is, hey seller, what are your plans after we sell this property? Do you need to sell this to buy something else? Are we doing a contingency? Or are you just simply going to, you know, move out? Very important, guys. Very, very important to have that conversation with them. We recently had a situation where the seller decided they wanted a contingency in the middle of a transaction. This is where they're supposed to decide. That's kind of hard to do once you get into escrow. And then, of course, their initials on the bottom. And then the last page, again, pretty self-explanatory. Property address, seller, sign, dates, real estate broker, your signature, your license number, address, emails, telephones, all that good stuff. Pretty self-explanatory. One thing I did want to bring up on this page, how many of you are familiar with the representative capacity signature disclosure? Patty, good. The RCSD. Okay, so what that form is, since most of you don't know what that is, it's a separate form that a trustee might sign. So let's say that the Claudia Bravo Living Trust is the owner of this printer and we're selling this printer, but I am signing for it. So what that form is, it lets you know who's signing for the trust. But we have a separate form for that, and it is still very, very much in use. But with the listing agreement added now, point it out to you guys. Up here, I'm very short, but on the top of the box, there's a little box that says entity sellers. So now, if you fill out that section of the form, you don't have to do that separate RCSD form. You can actually add the trust information, the signer's information there. If you fill that out correctly, you can save yourself the trouble of printing out that additional form. And then it's also gonna be on the RPA, but that's, again, a separate cost, but just a little fun fact there if you wanna save yourself a little bit of work. Any questions on the listing agreement, guys? It's pretty straightforward. All right. Your seller's advisory. So this, again, is attached to the listing agreement. This one, you just have to add your property address and make sure that the seller signs at the bottom. And it just goes over a list of legal and practical issues for the seller to consider when selling their property. You know, how to think about how they're gonna fill out those disclosures, the contract terms, and any marketing issues or ideas you might have for them. And this one is a 2-page document, so again, pretty self-explanatory. Just make sure you're filling in all of those lines. And like I said, I'll be giving you a copy of this, so you kind of have a little step-by-step guide. This one's new, newish. It's the CCPA, kind of a handful, California Consumer Privacy Act Advisory. This one just explains to your consumer, you know, how we protect their personal information, to think about who they're giving their personal information to, and then, you know, they're going to be giving us personal information. Of course, we have to safeguard it the best way we can. Oh, that's it. So that's a listing agreement, guys. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. It's you know, about a 15-page document. You know, so if you just kind of familiarize yourself with it, ask your sellers those questions. You know, you can avoid, you know, potential setbacks, possible cancellations, embarrassing conversations with our sellers. So it's important to learn it, fill it out correctly, send it in to us to review for you guys. And yeah, do you guys have any questions or any scenarios you'd like to run by me? Anything you have in pipeline?
I guess I'm meeting with a friend who wants to sell his house, and he does have his house on the trust, or it's under a trust, so I'm barely gonna look at it. So that whole thing is like pretty new to me.
Yeah.
So I guess that was one of the biggest things too for me, just making sure I have everything right.
Yeah. So always look at your trust whenever we are dealing with trust and see who the signers are, because sometimes it could only be one signer, sometimes it could be multiple signers. And we have to look at the language in those trusts, because sometimes it says that both people on the trust have to sign, or sometimes it could just be one person. So we always want to look at those, and whenever we're in doubt, send them over to your title rep, because they're going to tell you ahead of time, hey, we might need this affidavit signed, or hey, we noticed that they kind of did this outside of escrow and it wasn't insured, so we're going to need a few more signatures, you know, from those sellers. You can still list the property, and we encourage you to do so. Like if you know that they're the legal sellers, and that's fine, just kind of have to work on, you know, smoothing out some of the issues. That's fine, we can still list it. But you're already ahead of the game when it does get into escrow.
Okay.
Marina, I'm right on that, right?
Yeah.
Also, you guys, Marina is here. She is our wonderful escrow officer with Clearview Escrow. It's Maria, our junior escrow officer. And they're also here to help you guys with net sheets. That's another question we get a lot, you know, when getting listing agreements. How much do I charge for taxes? How much do I charge for, you know, title and escrow fees and all of that? So they can kind of help you guys calculate that. I rely on them all the time, you know, when I'm doing my listing agreements. I do my CMA, I run the numbers, and I send them to the girls, and they, you know, get me a net sheet to take to my listing appointment. Yes.
I actually wanted to share, it's super important that as the escrow office, that not only you send your purchase contract to our office, but also the listing agreement, because we also want to confirm, for example, the commission. If the seller is also purchasing property, if there's a contingency, we want to be aware of that ahead of time. And you be surprised how many times the sellers look at their commission instructions and are a little in shock, like, why am I paying this much on the commission? And we can show them, you know, well, your listing agreement that you signed says you agreed to this commission, and so that way they're not surprised. We just confirm that with them. But, you know, I'm Maria, I'm Marina's assistant, and I open the escrows for you guys, and I am more than happy to help your clients. Now we have DocuSign, which we've adopted, and I love to make it much more convenient for your clients, so we don't have to send appointments and FedEx. It's awesome. So thank you, Christian Maneva, for letting us have DocuSign. It has made our life so much easier, and theirs, and your clients, and that's what we want to do. We want to make it a very, very smooth
Did you guys
transaction.
get to sign your name on the little sheets for the raffle? Mr. Pierre did. I don't know where my little paper's on, so I have a little raffle for you guys. Marketing. I thought I did. Oh, here it is. Got it. Well, I was prepared, but I don't know what happened to ourselves. No time to sit.
While you're waiting on Claudia, just to let you guys know.
All right, I had really nice ones, but I don't know what happened. I think she just took off. But yeah, if you want to write your name down on this piece of paper, write it down. I have a little raffle for you guys.
And in the meantime,
You can toss your name.
our escrow officer is a notary. So if your sellers need anything to be notarized, they can conveniently come here if that's easy for them. You know, she's here Monday through Friday, so it's super, super helpful.
No, because I was doing a little raffle, I was like, oh, if you want to write your name